Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Ben Rhodes. I'm the Senior Vice President with CAMS. With me today, I have Chris Gelwicks. He's going to lead our presentation on all about committees. Chris and I were joking a little while ago about the impetus of this session stemmed from a poem that I heard many years titled, "Oh, give me your pity, I'm on a committee." So I kind of joke about that, but not all committees have to be bad committees. So today, Chris is going to walk us through all the things you need to know about managing committees and working on committees. So as a reminder, we do record these sessions and they will be available at camsmgt.com under webinars. So feel free to share this information with your other board members that may be interested. We will also be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So use the Q&A option. You can type in that question and I will read the question and help get that to Chris so he can answer those questions at the end of the session. So Chris, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Good evening, everybody. Glad y'all could join. This is, again, my name is Chris Gelwicks with the McIntosh Law Firm located in Davidson, North Carolina. I do all things related to HOA work in both states, North and South Carolina. And happy to do this. This is probably the 7th or 8th one of these I've done. And as a little bit of background before I jump in, Ben and I put this together for I guess a big presentation in the summer. So we've gone through this a little bit, so hopefully nothing will be foreign to me as I go through it. But I will say that my opinion when this topic came up was, well, that's going to be pretty dry, Ben. I mean, do you really think people are going to be interested in this? And as it turns out, there's quite a lot of interesting topics related to committees, on their formation, on how they operate, what their powers are. So I thought it's probably a good idea we do this again. So we'll give it a shot. Hope you all enjoy it. And yes, put your questions in. I'll answer as many as I can when we're done. I'm going to share my screen here because we do have a PowerPoint for this. And so Ben, can you see that? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So yeah, it's all about committees, and I paraphrased the poem title from Ben. But I think the first thing we talk about when we talk about committees is, what's the purpose? And I put these little adjectives in here because committees, I have found in HOA work, sometimes committees get on the nerves of the board that appoints them. So, you know, the annoying, vexing, exasperating. And whose fault is that? You know, well, that really could be the board's. It could be, you know, it could be the people that are on the committee. It could be a combination of both. That's unfortunate because committees are developed. They're allowed to be created by statute and usually your bylaws, because there's a lot of work to do, as you all know, when it comes to being on the board, getting things done. Management companies can't do it all, and board members certainly can't do it all. And as Ben has heard me say, and if you've heard me speak before in the last couple of years, I was on my board of directors for my homeowners association, and we had a few committees. An architecture committee is always the one everyone refers to, but we had other ones. We had a social committee. We have we are a lake property in our community, so we had a dock committee. Again, the committees, you know, the members that are put on there, they serve the board, they help in the decision making, they do research, and then they provide opinions. And then, but in the end, most of the time, it's the board that makes the decisions from those committees. And so, you know, before we get into the inner workings, unfortunately, we are human and we all have our own agendas. And so people who volunteer for these committees when the board forms one sometimes have their own self-interest. And things like, why do people volunteer for committees? Well, they're discontented with what the board's doing. They have their own self-interest. They have a job. They have a project that they want to get finished. And so they volunteer to be on them. You know, or they couldn't get on the board for some reason. The members did not elect them to the board, but if they get on a committee and they try to try to get that stuff done, get their stuff done that way. You know, giving back to the community is a positive reason. Of course, getting educated on how things run, and, you know, everyone's favorite, recognition. Now, recognition for being on a committee, I've been to hundreds of board meetings and HOA meetings through my career, and I rarely hear too many boards give thanks to the committees who do work on it, on a project, unless it's some big project. Nevertheless, I preface all that to say, you know, when you're a board member, committees are helpful when you appoint people, and we'll talk about how that works in a few minutes. But when you appoint people, you need to understand that the people you're appointing may have any one of these or other interests in mind when they get on there. And so picking the right people is important. Governing them appropriately is important. So when we're talking about committees, there are two main types. There's a standing committee and a special committee, and those are defined in the slides. But a standing committee, as an example, is an architectural review committee. Those types of committees are permanent, and when I say permanent, they are created either in their documents or they are created through the board process of just appointing and making committee, but they are there for an ongoing, continuous reason. A special committee, on the other hand, is one created for a specific project. Now, these terms, there's not going to be a quiz at the end whether you understand them, but they're pretty self-explanatory. You may hear other terms: administrative, project, study, or problem-solving committee, a liaison committee. That was a new one for me when the slide was put together. Those are all just special types of the first two types of committees. So the idea here is, when we're talking about committees, it could either be permanent or could be temporary for a special project and then be disbanded. And so when we're dealing with that, we're looking at first who has the authority to create the committees. And I have provided here on this slide just a couple of standards. North Carolina General Statutes and the South Carolina Code, both in the Nonprofit Corporation Act, and the code references are there, allow the boards, allow the corporation, in this case the homeowners association or condo association, to create bylaws and articles, to create them, and unless the bylaws and articles from the corporation indicate otherwise, the board has the authority to create as many committees as it sees necessary. The only requirements for those committees, again, unless the bylaws say something different, is that there must be at least 2 members. And I've capitalized something here on this slide that I think is important. They must, the language in the code and in the statute is that they must have at least 2 members who serve at the pleasure of the board. What does that mean? I'm going to dive into this closer to the end of the presentation, but it means essentially that you can, as a committee, the member can be appointed or removed at the board's discretion for any or no reason. That's by design. And now, if you might give you an example of an architectural review committee, sometimes you see restrictions, covenants, master deeds, things like that, that have language in there that indicate that certain committees, for example, an architectural review committee, must be voted upon by the members. That's rare. But if it says that in there, you have to follow that process. But generally speaking, the board is the one that creates and appoints these committees. And if you've heard me speak in the past, hopefully you've all, if you're a board member and a manager, you have heard me or other attorneys reference the business judgment rule. Business judgment rule is a creature of common law, meaning case law, and also statute or South Carolina Code, both in the Nonprofit Act. And that business judgment rule basically says a board member has a duty to act in good faith. Well, the same standards apply to committee members. They must also act in good faith and in the best interest of the association. One thing about the business judgment rule, and I've cited the code sections there, that talks about where the authority comes from to create them. But there's a subsection in each of those that indicates that simply by creating a committee does not mean that the board has fulfilled its fiduciary duties to act in good faith. And why do I say that? Because the business judgment rule has language in there that says that if you are a board and you are a member and you create a committee for a specific purpose to do investigation and make recommendations, you're entitled to rely on that committee recommendation in making your decision. So if you make a wrong one, but it was made in good faith and the committee it was created for that purpose to investigate and report back, then you're probably not going to be personally liable for a bad decision. But simply creating it what I'm noting in this section here. Simply creating a committee is not enough. You actually need to put people on the committee that are tasked with to meet the needs of a certain project, bring the information back, and they need to be people who are, how I would say, educated enough to do the job. And again, that committee, all committee members have the same fiduciary duties as board members. Now, we're going to jump around a little bit into what's the paper, what's the document behind the creation of any committee. Well, that's usually called the charter. The charter is a document created on behalf of the corporation that describes the committee, its purpose, how many people are going to be on it, their term of service, if there is one, who's can serve, the number, etc. All of that stuff goes into your charter. One thing that you could parse out, for example, there's a item here about can delinquent owners serve. That is something you may want to put in a charter if you're forming a committee. You want to allow delinquent owners to serve or not. And the charter sets forth the parameters, the workings of the committee, and they could be very general in nature. The committee is created to perform architectural review as guided by the Declaration of Covenants. That's a sufficient purpose. That's a sufficient guide, because the Declaration of Covenants that you're referring to hopefully will have specific procedures. There's an example here, for example, that this is you shall do this, you shall not do that, and of course provide receipts to get reimbursed. Those are just examples of things you may see in charters. Understand that the board, absent any other document, again, you'll hear me refer a lot to architectural review committees in this presentation, because they are a creature of usually a declaration or master deed. But generally speaking, if a board gives decision-making authority to a committee, that committee then basically makes the decision on something just as the board would. And it is that the decision they make is as grounded in the law and is as enforceable as if the board had done it. And again, I refer back to architectural review committees. Most of the documents that I've seen, the documents that I write for sure, when an architectural review committee is created and given authority to approve architectural plans, for example, that decision of that committee is the final one. Now, there may be a review process or an appeal process, but that committee is charged with authority to make decisions. And so the idea of a charter is to set forth what decisions, if any, that committee can make. Is it an advisory committee where all they do is they report back, or are they a decision-making committee? Now, who drafts these things? This has come up because Ben and I have dealt with this over the last couple of years. There's no guidance on who has to draft these things. These are considered legal documents, but anyone can probably get on LegalZoom, and no, this is not helping my practice in saying this, but probably anybody can go on LegalZoom and look up a charter or a resolution and create it. But the issue here is, the North Carolina bar has spoken on this, at least in a specific instance. A charter, because it guides how an association acts with its committees and how the board interacts with the committee, the drafting of a charter is considered the practice of law, at least according to the North Carolina bar. As such, this is a charter is not something that a board should create on its own. It should come to association council, whether that's me or someone else. Certainly, the manager for your association probably has stock charters somewhere where you all can put something together and then give it to the attorney for review, tweaking, etc. A resolution to create a committee is not the same as a charter. A resolution is a board makes a decision. We're going to create a committee to, I'll use the example of my association, to investigate whether we need to replace our docket in 5 years. So that is a committee that's a resolution of a board to create the committee, but the actual charter, the actual meat and potatoes of what that committee does is in the charter, and that should be drafted by an attorney. So keep that all of that in mind. Wouldn't want anybody to get in trouble with the bar. They can get nasty for people who are practicing law without a license. When a committee is appointed, obviously, just as a board does, the boards have a president, the committee's got to have a chair. It is my opinion, it is the opinion of many managers and other attorneys that I speak with, that the board should recruit the chairperson. Why is that? Because and that to me should be self-explanatory. But you want a person who's in charge of that committee who works well with the board, who sees the goal of the committee, and will push the committee members towards completing that goal. Obviously the board, the structure for the leader is to keep the focus of the committee on what the task is. You know, what I'm going through here next in this slide is simply what are some things you look for in a good chairperson? Organized, have the time to participate, do things, and association focus, who's focused on the fiduciary duty. Now, I take a little bit of issue with number 2 here, have time and to serve and participate. And the only reason is because, having been on my board, the time it takes sometimes to be on a board to go through these meetings every month can be cumbersome. Nevertheless, it is a time commitment. A board has a time commitment, and your committees have time commitments. You don't want people on there who don't have time to meet and discuss what their job is, to discuss the results of what they're finding, one of the worst ones is, this comes up a lot, architectural review committees where you have to reply to an owner who makes a submission within a set time. If you have people on that committee that cannot meet and make a decision within that set time, like usually it's 30 days, then you can have a problem, because many of the documents that I read, I don't write them this way, but I read a lot of documents that say that if there's an architectural submission on December 1 and the committee has not responded by December 31, whatever is submitted is approved. So then when that happens, and that has happened, normally it is because people in the committee are on vacation, or they're not responding to the call for a meeting to discuss these things. And so it is, for a committee like that, for all committees, but especially one where you have time constraints, the people that are on it must be committed to serve and participate within the parameters provided. If they're not, as I go back 3 or 4 slides, the board should get rid of the people that aren't willing to do that and put people on there who are willing to participate and serve in a timely manner. Vitally important. And of course, as committee chair, obviously you need to value everybody's input. The committee chair, by the way, is not a position that it is a position that can be appointed by the board. It can be appointed by the committee members themselves. You can put it in the charter however you want. Here's a slide that is interesting, and this is leading to more what I was talking about, who appoints what. Does the committee run the board, or the board run the committee? If the committee's not doing its job, I'm going to give you an example. Your architectural control committee is not following the guidelines. It is approving things that should not be approved, or it is not approving things that should be automatically approved. What's the issue? I've dealt with an association a little over a year ago that had 5 members on an architectural control committee, a 5-member board. 2 of the board members were on the architectural control committee as well. And the architectural control committee was doing its own thing. If it didn't feel like enforcing the guidelines, it didn't. If it felt like going more restrictive than what was in the restrictions or in the guidelines, it was doing that. And the board, the president specifically, and the manager got on a phone call with me and said, we need to amend our declaration of covenants to put more restraints on the architectural control committee. And I said, wait a minute, let me pull the documents. And I pulled the documents and I looked at them and I said, well, there's nothing in here that says the board that the board can't do what it has the power to do, which is remove the offending member or members. They came to me and we had multiple conversations about proposing amendments and resolutions addressing the roles of members and their jobs, when what they really could have done is that these offending members are not doing their job, remove them. The board has that power, unless it's limited in some fashion. And in these documents, there was not limited. Get them off of there, because obviously they have their own agenda, or they don't care what is written in the restrictions, or for whatever reason. That's just a toxic environment. And instead, and what I tried to tell that president and that manager is the board's in charge. Even though the committee makes the decision, the board in the end has the final say, because it can appoint and remove in its own discretion. This is going to come up again later in this presentation, but I did want to emphasize this all the time. The committees serve at the discretion of the board. I'm going to pound that into y'all. If you get nothing else, remember the board has the power to appoint and remove. So this one is more of a practical slide. You know, communication with the chair, chairing the meetings. You want an agenda prepared by, hopefully by the chairperson. That's the chairperson's job. Just as the president's job for a board meeting is to prepare the agenda, it is the chairman's job to prepare the agenda for a committee meeting. You know, it is inevitably someone will need extra agendas, and these are all practical tips to follow. I'm not going to get into all of these. One thing I will note, and you'll see this again later in the slides as well, simply because you're a committee doesn't mean you don't have to follow the formalities of meeting protocol, specifically Robert's rules. There are statutory sections in both North and South Carolina which require committee meetings to be held in the same fashion as board meetings. What does that mean? Well, you got to take minutes. I get that question a lot, and I will be honest. I went a number of years without knowing that. And I went through, and if you look at this, and went through the Nonprofit Corporation Act, because this question kept coming up. Do we need to make motions? Do we need to have minutes? And reality is, yes, you do. It is a function of each committee to conduct its meetings, its sessions, in accordance with Robert's rules. I like to say Bob's rules, if it's to make it a little more informal in your meetings. But there needs to be a record of what's going on, which means minutes. So these are just some examples for you to look at and get some idea on how to run the committee meetings. Again, A up top, committee members serve at the discretion of the board. It is, I'm going to say that again before this is over, so just remember that. When you're appointing committee members, you need to set expectations from the beginning. The charter should take care of that. There should be a liaison between the board and the committee. Sometimes that is a board member who is actually on the committee. Other times it's just communication, a lot of communication between a board member and the committee itself. In case any of you didn't know this, committees who have been formed by the board, who have reports, I've seen it done a couple of ways. They actually send somebody to attend a board meeting who then reads through what the committee has done, or they submit a report to the board for every board meeting. Either way it's done, you got to go with what you think as a board is the best. Is it better to have someone there in person to talk about what's going on, or is it better to have a written report? I like written reports because you have documented there what the committee has been doing over the last month and a half. there's some advice here about managers attending. I think it is a good idea, especially for those who've never formed a committee or have never been on a committee before. When a committee is first starting, the first meeting or two, it is good to have someone there who has run meetings before, manager or a board member, who can sort of guide the discussion and guide the process for a committee. Some other issues. A question that comes up a lot, and I alluded to this already, but I'll go over here in this context. Who has the final say in architectural review issues? Is it the board or is it the architectural review committee? And the answer is it depends on the documents, because the documents will likely, and the ones that I write usually do, will make all the decision making on ARC issues leave that to the committee and take that out of the hands of the board. And here's where it gets sticky. And I again, this is just coming from experience. Who has the power to enforce a violation? An example is a homeowner submits a request to construct a fence. And the submission has a white picket fence. The ARC approves the white picket fence. The owner then puts on a black wrought iron fence on the property. That owner has not complied with what was approved. The question then is, well, who has the power to deal with that violation? Is it the ARC or is it the board? And the answer to that is it's the board. I've cited North Carolina statutes in this slide, and that's 47F or 47C 3107.1 and 3112. Those are the hearing statutes in North Carolina. Who has the power to conduct hearings, to levy fines and suspend privileges in North Carolina? The board does. The ARC does not have that power and never will have that power and should never have that power. The ARC is not the one holding the hearing. The ARC may come to the hearing and present evidence as to why an owner who put up the wrought iron fence is in violation. But the ARC is not the one making the decision about whether a violation occurred. That is the board. In South Carolina, if you're a South Carolina association, I'm sure you're aware there is no statutory mandate on how you may fine or suspend privileges. In fact, because there's no statutory mandate, you must have that authority in your documents. There must be something in there that says you have the ability to levy a fine and suspend privileges. But again, that is if it's in there, it's going to be a board power. It is not going to be an ARC power. I have had a couple of associations, one even in the last year, who I had to explain ad nauseum in a written opinion and then have a call with both the ARC and the board as to why the ARC did not have the power to levy a fine. The ARC had been levying fines and suspending privileges for a year for violations. And when I gave them a written opinion that said, no, that's the board's decision, the ARC should not have that power. The ARC committee members were not happy with me because I took their power away. I didn't take their power away. They never had the power and never should have had the power. But that's why reading your documents and understanding who does what and how these committees and boards interact together is so important. And so let me just, for the final part of this portion of the slide, let me just reiterate. A committee's job, its power stems from the board, but the board is the one that has the decision-making on who to appoint. And in North Carolina, and I would say in South Carolina, if your documents say it, the board is the one that determines if there's remedial action to be taken against an owner for violating an architectural issue, for example. But another question, not common questions I get are about nominating committees. What's a nominating committee? If any of you have a nominating committee, ones I've seen normally are, again, board appointed for a specific purpose. As we go back, they are a standard committee appointed every year for what purpose? Well, a nominating committee is supposed to, what I call vet the nominees. Now, what do I mean by vet? If you have 5 spots open for an election at the annual meeting, and you have 10 candidates that submit their names in advance, the nominating committee's job, in my opinion, is to look at those 10 candidates, talk to them, and then make recommendations to the membership about the 5 best or the 8 best or however many they think would be the best ones to serve. Now, I get a lot of pushback on that analysis because if no one in a homeowners association wants to sit on a nominating committee and then say one neighbor of theirs is not a good candidate, but another neighbor is. I understand that. That can get sticky. I get it. But the purpose of a nominating committee is not to sit there and just collect names and put them on a ballot. The board can do that. The management company can do that. That is not the nominating committee's job. Nominating committee's job is to vet candidates. That doesn't mean that if you get 10 candidates, 10 nominees in, and the board and the nominating committee recommends 5, that doesn't mean all 10 don't go on a ballot. That just means that the nominating committee is recommending certain ones on that ballot. That doesn't mean they're going to get elected. It just means, again, the nominating committee is doing its job by vetting the candidates and pointing out who the best ones are. I'll give you an example of where this has come into play recently. I represent an association right now where a member has filed a lawsuit over an architectural issue against the association. That individual has also put their name in the hat to be on the board, and it will be running at the next annual meeting. The nominating committee for the association has actually asked me, can they disclose to the membership that this lawsuit was filed by this owner and recommend that the members not vote for this owner? My response is the lawsuit is public, so you don't have to disclose it, but yes, you may disclose it. You're not violating any confidentiality if you do. And yes, absolutely, it should be disclosed to the membership that this lawsuit is there, and that the members should be very reticent to elect this person. Not because they may not be right, but because they have a adverse interest to the association. And again, and it's an example of something a committee like a nominating committee would have to deal with. It's not fun. It's not pleasant to choose one neighbor over another, but that's the role of the committee. If the committee is required, many nominating committees are required in your bylaws. I've seen, I would say more than half of the associations I represent have a requirement that a nominating committee be formed. If a nominating committee is created but then doesn't vet anybody, you're really defeating the purpose of a nominating committee. Moving on, common procedural questions. I've already addressed this, and we're coming to the end of the slides, Ben, by the way. Do committees take minutes? Yes, we addressed that earlier. What are minutes? Minutes are not what is said at a meeting. Minutes are not the opinion of the chair or committee members about something. Minutes are records of action taken. Statutorily, North Carolina General Statutes and South Carolina Codes, which is both of these are Nonprofit Corporation Act sections in those states. These sections 20 through 24 require committees to follow them, just like boards. 820 is meetings. What is that section? That talks about meetings are to be held regularly, that they are conducted, and it has to do with meeting notices. That's 822. So notices of board meetings you have to send out. You have to give, usually it's more than 3 days notice, that type of thing. Same thing for committee meetings. Actions without meeting, the unanimous consent stuff. Okay, so the action by emails. Okay, when you need, if you want to make a decision when you're not in a meeting, you can email everybody can email their consent. If it's unanimous, then the action is approved. Same way with committees. Notices of meetings can be waived if you're a board member. Same way with committees. And finally, you got to have a quorum must be present. You must have a quorum of your committee present before you can then make a decision on anything, if that's what your role is. So committees are not informal little bodies created by boards to sit around and do nothing. Committees are created for specific purposes, and they have certain formalities that must be that statutorily they must be followed. That is the end of the initial presentation, Ben, and we went through a lot of slides there. That's probably the fastest I've gone through them. So happy to take any questions.
Excellent. So I guess the first question that came in is dealing with if your documents are silent on setting committees up, does the board have the authority to set up a committee?
Yes, in North and South Carolina, that is the statute that I had addressed way back in the beginning of the slide. Let me find it. It's North Carolina General Statute 55A 8-25, South Carolina Code 33-31 825. Both of those sections indicate that a board can create a committee unless the bylaws indicate otherwise. So unless the bylaws or the articles of incorporation say you cannot create a committee, you can create as many committees as you want.
Okay. I guess another question, if a committee is not doing what the board requests, what is the proper process for dissolving or removing committee members?
Well, I wouldn't recommend dissolving committee. If a committee is created for a specific reason, I would not dissolve the committee in and of itself. In other words, the committee body, for lack of a better word, entity. It's not an entity, but you know what I mean. But the process for removal is the same as the process of appointing. The board has a meeting and decides we're going to remove Ben Rhodes from the committee, and they vote on it. And if a majority if a board meeting is called to order, it means you have a quorum. If a majority say remove them, they're removed. That's it. And then you appoint somebody else.
Okay. Do boards have to create committees if they don't want to?
If your documents, declaration, bylaws, articles of incorporation require that a committee be created, then the board must create it and appoint members to it. Absent that requirement, no, you do not. Perfect example, architectural control committees created by operation of law in your declaration of covenants. Normally those are created by the developer, and then the association turns over and the members take over. If there's not one created, but one's required by your declaration of covenants, then the board is required to follow whatever procedure it is to put that committee in place, whether it's appointing or perhaps holding an election to get members on it. Likewise, nominating committees, I see that again. The bylaws generally say there shall be a nominating committee. When you see those words, the board is required to create it. Absent that mandate, you're not ever required to create a committee.
To follow up on that question, can a board also hold architectural committee positions, and so you're dealing with one and the same body?
That happens frequently, as you know, and the response to that is, unless the documents prohibit it, yes, you can have a dual role. That happens a lot. There's no prohibition on it.
Okay, I know you commented on this earlier, but would you suggest having an attorney review any charter for a committee?
Yes. Oh, if you'd like me to expand on that, again, the creation of a charter has been, at least in North Carolina, deemed by the bar basically the practice of law. And that's not meant to scare anybody. What it means is that there are legal issues in there in the charters that must be addressed, and they must be addressed properly. So a charter, there's no set language that a charter needs. There's no set requirements to be in it. Create it, put its purpose in there. But it is good to have an attorney review, because sometimes things go in a charter that really shouldn't go in there. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to harp back on this again. Creating a term. A committee member shall serve for 2 years. Well, why? Why would you put that in your charter? If you were to put that in your charter and have me review it, I would ask you, why do you want that? Because a committee member then believes that they cannot be removed for 2 years. That to me is trying to take away a authority of the board that shouldn't be taken away. So I would not, this is an example, I would not recommend putting a term of office, so to speak, in a committee charter. Just an example. I think it's important for those documents. And I also think it's important for the resolution that the board uses to adopt or create the committee, I think that's important to be reviewed too by an attorney.
Okay, how do you feel about creating a budget line for committees? For example, landscaping committees that's managed outside of the board view. So giving a landscape committee the authority to spend money.
First of all, that's allowed statutorily. Again, you can assign that authority to make decisions on landscaping. I'll use that example to a landscape committee. They have the right to spend money. What I would say is I would caution any board to create a committee without oversight. Your oversight is obviously the ability to appoint and remove. When it comes to spending money, while a committee may have the authority to do it, if there is what is perceived to be overspending on something, the members of the association are probably not going to yell at the committee, they're going to yell at the board. And so you can create a landscape committee with that authority. I would recommend at a minimum routine review of the decisions and spending to make sure that it is within parameters. You can also put in the charter that there be a limit on what can be spent without board approval. Just an example, if there's a, you want to increase your landscape contract from $50,000 to $75,000, that's a 50% increase. That might be something that you might not want to just leave for the committee. So keep that in mind. But you can assign a committee to enter into contracts, and do something like that. So that's allowed. I would caution you to not give the committee too much power.
Speaking of power, we have a committee that would like to draft rules for our board. Is that allowed? Or rules for our board to follow? Is that allowed?
You can create a committee for anything you want. I would wonder why you would want to have a committee to create rules for the board, but I understand the reasoning behind it. So I would assume, for example, more like a code of conduct type scenario is what I would be thinking.
Yep, not specific, but I know from time to time you say the tail wags the dog. Can committees adopt rules for boards?
Not without board approval. That's an odd question. I see where you're going with it. In the end, the board should always flex its muscles when it has to. I would not cede authority to create rules on how I am acting as a board to a committee, unless those rules, before they're put into place, would be reviewed and approved by us. And if we don't approve them, they don't apply. That type of thing.
Okay, and this is kind of a two-part question, so I'll ask two ways. But how often should boards have public meetings, and then how often should committees have public meetings? And I don't know if this is North or South Carolina.
So in North Carolina, there is a statutory requirement that at regular intervals, and that's not defined, because our legislature in North Carolina decided, no, we're just going to let y'all figure out what a regular interval is. The board should allow members of the association to come and speak their mind. And that's 47 FNC 3108. South Carolina doesn't have that statute. And so either way, when you're talking about meeting of the members and the board, public meetings, I'm going to talk about board meetings first. Whatever's reasonable. You have an annual meeting every year. That's why it's annual. And usually that is the time where everyone talks about what's going right or wrong with the association. But that's not a board meeting. And so, my association, we did that once a year. I know some associations have open board meetings every month. I know some associations that do it every quarter. Depending on the size of your membership, I would say it's probably a good idea to do it at least twice a year. But there's no set standard on that. South Carolina, unless your bylaws or articles or declaration of covenants require you to have an open board meeting. You're never required to have a meeting with your members, but I encourage it. Transparency is always something that is an issue with homeowners associations. It shouldn't be, but when we're dealing with homeowners and homes and fees and assessments and things like that, it can get, people want to know where the money's going, and that's understandable. For committees, on the other hand, you know, I would not encourage members being able to sit in on committee meetings. Committees are, again, for a specific purpose. I would not want, I'm just using architectural review committee, for example. I would not want members of the community to sit in there and see plans that are submitted by an owner specific to the architectural review committee, and see the discussion on that. Members of the community may have their own opinion, and their opinion doesn't matter because they're not on the committee. So I don't really encourage that with committees. I've never had that come up. Certainly with boards, I do think it is important to meet regularly with your membership.
Okay, what is your opinion on committees providing work on association property?
In other words, landscape committee goes out and cleans up the property, cuts the grass, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I discourage it for many reasons. One is liability. There's no workers' comp insurance. You all are volunteers. Liability purposes, if someone gets hurt, heaven forbid somebody steps in a hole and hurts themselves, or they're cutting a tree limb down and it falls on somebody's head, and all those types of things, you have insurance, you would hope that that would cover it. But the idea there is, in my opinion, is when you're doing something on, hopefully it's common property, common area, you want a professional doing it, someone who's licensed, someone who insures their work, warranties their work. So if there's a problem, they can, you know, the contractor will then solve the problem, either their insurance company or themselves. If I go out as a member of the association and do something, my work is not warranted, and I have no insurance. I certainly, and so I discourage it.
And I'm glad you said that, because we have lots of horror stories about committees and uninsured people doing work, which is one reason we have the insurance requirements that we do.
Yes,
that many of you know about.
And I'll just comment one other thing. Sometimes people come in, it's all we want to do is paint a fence. I understand that's all we want to do is paint a fence, but you're using, you are, if it's a fence on common area, that fence is like there for everybody. It needs to be, everybody's paying assessments to maintain these things. Use your assessments wisely and hire a contractor to do it. Doesn't matter what it is.
Okay, what do you think the best practice is for addressing a homeowner who wants to form a committee to move a personal agenda along that would need funding from the HOA, which would result in a dues increase without, and how would you do that without making the person mad?
You wouldn't. They're going to get mad. Okay. If first of all, we're dealing with, I want to be very, very clear here. We're dealing with board created committees or document created required committees. We're not dealing with a homeowner who says, I want to form a committee to remove the board. That's different. That's among the members. We're not talking about that because that's not board sanctioned. That's not board appointed. So if an owner comes and says, I want to form a committee, and you know they have an agenda, well, whose job is it to form the committee? The board. If they're not on the board, they don't get to form the committee. The board can consider it and shut it and say, no, we're not going to create this committee, or they can say yes. Either way, if an owner clearly has an agenda and they're going to have to, and plus they're going to want to spend money and cause an assessment raise, there's no delicate way to do this. It's no, we're not going to create the committee, period. If you wish to create the committee, the annual meeting is in a month. You may run and get on the board if you win and create your committee that way. Now, I'd say it nicer than that, but the reality behind it is if an owner is pushing their own agenda you don't want them on a committee. And again, if you were to put them on a committee, you would want to remove them if they start pushing their own agenda. The committee must act in the association's best interest, not a personal.
So should associations establish committees that are working on items outside of the association's purview? For example, town or political issues?
I would shy away from political issues, simply because that can get very dicey because you're not going to get agreement with everybody. If you, for example, I've seen associations create committees to deal with town issues, ordinances, perhaps condemnation, things like that. There's no problem with that. I think the issue is it related in some fashion to the association membership? Then it's probably okay. If you're going to throw money at it, though, I would want to be able to point to something that strongly ties whatever the committee is working on to association best interest. Not a homeowner's best interest, but individual, but the association corporate entity's best interest. If you can tie to that, then it's okay. If you can't, I certainly wouldn't throw money at it. And the other part of it is this, and this goes to the political one. If the association forms a committee to deal with a political issue, the board can then be deemed to be supporting one side or the other, and that's not the board's job. Board's job is not to support a political issue. Board's job is to enforce the restrictions, collect assessments, work for the general betterment of the community. And so I'm not sure I'm answering that, except to say, if it's related to the best community interest, it's probably okay. Other than that, if you can't find a strong link there, then I'd shy away from it.
Okay, last question. Should a landscape committee be responsible for managing homeowner complaints about the landscape contractor, or is that a confidential discussion that should not be shared with the committee and go to another outlet, meaning board or manager?
Well, it depends on the role of the committee, how much authority you give it. If the committee is acting as a liaison between the members and the contractor, I'd say it's probably fine. On the other hand, and in fact, I'm trying to think of a situation where that wouldn't be. Why create a committee if they're not going to be that liaison? If they're not going to have that role to go to the contractor and say, we're getting these complaints. I don't think that's a problem at all. Terms of the contract, that's a little bit different. Really, I'm not sure I would want to create a committee who has the authority to actually bind the association to a landscaping contract. That should be done by the board, in my opinion. But I think the landscape committee can vet contracts, can go get them, make a recommendation, and then the board can enter into it. And then, how the committee and the board work together in dealing with complaints, that's something that can be worked out in the charter just through the relationship.
Okay. Well, that is all the questions. So, Chris, I thank you for your time again.
Sure, anytime.
I'm sure we will have you back in the coming months.
All right.
So,
well,
everybody,
thanks,
yep, thank you for staying with us till the end. Reminder, we do these the third Thursday of every month. So we look forward to your participation and ongoing participation. And they are recorded, so you can find them at camsmgt.com under the webinar section. So thank you very much and have a good night.
You'll have a good Thanksgiving. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.